I thought I'll start by briefly reviewing where we have been in the past. Last time I was here, we talked about Brahman, Atman, and Tattvamasi. Didn't get a chance to talk about Atman and Tattvamasi because of time. But regarding Brahman, what was said was this is the first important assumption, you might call it the God assumption of Hinduism, that Brahman is Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. And very briefly, Anantam was infinite in space, time, and objects. And Satyam and Jnanam meant that Brahman is the one that makes existence possible. That is Satyam, and that makes consciousness possible, and that is Jnanam. So those were briefly the interpretations of Satyam, Jnanam, and Anantam. And as a consequence of these three assumptions, it follows that Brahman is the one who makes bliss possible for us. That is Ananda. And while I did not get into it last time, you can also show that as we show, for example, as proofs in plane geometry, you can also show that Brahman is the ultimate reality. We didn't prove it last time, but it's fairly straightforward. So that was the gist of that talk. What I'm essentially trying to do in these is to put forth or to describe the my interpretation at any rate. And that's all I can do, my interpretation of Hindu metaphysics, right? So we start off with Brahman. And as I said earlier, this is the key assumption, one key assumption of Hinduism, the definition in a sense of what Brahman is. Then it happens that one could then say that if you believe in this and if you are willing to live by this, then there is a way of getting to permanent happiness, which is what Ananda is. But that requires faith. And maybe less than 1% of people in this world might have that degree of faith with which they lead their life. So what about the rest of the 99%? And that's when I tried to present this second talk, another talk on happiness and contribution, happiness and purposeful life, which is simply based upon a simple, straightforward, practical assumption, almost a fact, that we are happy when we get what we want. I think most people will generally agree with that we are happy when our desires are satisfied. Based upon that assumption and using the theory of what is called the Poisson distribution in statistics, it follows that these equations that I'm showing on the screen follow. And from those equations, it is possible to say what needs to happen in order to maximize both purposefulness or contributions and also happiness. So this was a non-theological version of accomplishing those two objectives. If you do not have faith in Hinduism or any other religion. The third talk dealt with creation of this universe according to three different ways of looking at it. One is the Advaita Vedantic view. The second is the Dvaita Vedantic view. And finally, the scientific view. And in as much as Brahman was already shown to be the ultimate reality, then it follows that this universe must have come from Brahman. And this equation that I am showing here, x minus y equals x, is the creation equation that we went through in that particular talk. I don't want to redo this. And the solutions to this equation tend to lead to these three ideas about what the universe is and how it was created. The three ideas being those due to Advaita, Dvaita, and scientific points of view. So that's what we have covered in the past. And as I said earlier, I think of all of this as almost coming from the kindergarten of Hindu philosophy. And the idea being to communicate the metaphysical aspects. It is almost like the theoretical foundation of Hinduism. And once this is understood, then people can go on, and I'm thinking particularly of younger people, they can go on and learn the subject from the masters. That is my purpose in doing this. Now, today's topic has to do with the Varna system of Hinduism. I want to be upfront and say that I am not talking about the caste system or the jatis, etc., that are there in India. I don't think that the caste system has served us well, but that is not the subject today. The subject today is the original Varna system that is described in Bhagavad Gita, not the caste system. Unfortunately, what is happening now is that because of the ills of the caste system, Hinduism itself is getting blamed for it. That is unfortunate and inappropriate. It would be something like saying that because of slavery, Christianity ought to be blamed. It is something like that, and that is not the right thing to do. I don't think the religion can be blamed for, or the theory can be blamed for the practice that might have developed. So the Varna system of Hinduism, the Chatur Varna, the four Varnas, is the original personality classification system. You are all familiar with personality classifications that have more recently come around, like type A personality, type B personality, etc., etc. The Varna system, in my view, is the original personality classification system, and I am going to argue that maybe the time has come to bring it back, not to suppress it, but to bring it back in the way in which it was originally intended. So here is a brief summary of what I wanted to do that I wrote up. And let me just read it. The original Varna system of Hinduism is based on the notion that everyone is gifted with certain unique combination of tendencies suitable to serve specific needs of a well-functioning society, and a life spent identifying, nurturing, improving, and utilizing our special gifts is a purposeful and happy life. And I do believe that. And what I wanted to talk about in this talk is to describe how differences in human tendencies may have been used to systematize the original Varna system of Hindu philosophy. And I want to propose a mathematical equation to describe a fundamental assumption, and this would be the second assumption of Hinduism. The first assumption being the God assumption or the Brahman assumption that we went through already. This second assumption of made by the Sankhya philosophers having to do with Prakriti, and we will come to that. And I want to describe that in a mathematical equation and then essentially prove why the Chatur Varna system follows directly from that equation. In other words, it might have occurred to you as to why there are 4 Varnas. Why not have 3 Varnas? Or maybe 6 Varnas or 7 Varnas? What's so special about 4? So we want to prove that that is the right number. And what is the composition of each Varna? What distinguishes these 4 Varnas from each other? And how to assess and improve our own Varna, whatever Varna we might belong to. And this Varna, by the way, has nothing to do with where your birth occurred. It is not determined by the birth. And Krishna spends a lot of time talking about this in Bhagavad Gita. It might be interesting for me to tell you that once I went through all the 700 stanzas of Bhagavad Gita to look for how many of them deal with the 3 gunas, right? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, on which this Varna system is based. And it turned out that 20% of Bhagavad Gita is devoted to this topic. 20%, that's a lot. So obviously, Krishna thinks this as a very important subject to have spent 1/5 of his time talking about it. And finally, how to transcend Varna, right? How to transcend Varna. You're all familiar with, before I go there, let me just say that in the time we have today, it is not going to be possible to deal with this entire subject. It is not possible to describe, for me at least, 20% of Bhagavad Gita in 30 minutes. So I am going to give you a brief summary of the subject and maybe not deal with some aspects of it. Okay, so that's where we are going in this talk. And so let me get started. One thing we need to sort of understand is the human structure according to Hinduism. This is my version of talking about it. That there is body, mind, intellect, BMI. They are not exactly at the same level at which it's described here. Then on top of it, there are vasanas. These are the tendencies that people have. And then there is something called causal body. And I'm describing this causal body as consisting of 3 gunas. We won't have time today to get into the details of what these 3 gunas actually are, but looking at who is attending, I know that you are very thoroughly familiar with Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So for this audience, I think that's going to be okay. And then on top of it is the Atman. And then, according to me at least, there is a feedback loop that goes from how we behave to what happens to the causal body. So this is very well described in Chandogya Upanishad, I think. But that analogy needs to be extended to include causal body, which was, I believe, not done there. And so the chariot analogy becomes more like more like a taxi business in order to include all of these aspects. The other thing and again, we are not getting into the details of it. This subject itself probably merits at least a half hour to describe these things in detail. The only other thing I would say about it today is that while we are told regarding the unity of all individuals, that unity is happening at the Atman level. Below that, there is all diversity. And so the road to unity does go through a forest, a jungle of diversity. And it is important to understand this diversity, right? And one way of understanding it is to classify. So classification, you might say discrimination, is a very important activity. The entire field of science is based upon classification. So we do want to classify people in terms of body, mind, intellect, vasanas, causal body. And this classification system that we are about to talk about is happening at the causal body level. It is not that we are classifying people in terms of their gross body. Somebody is fat, somebody is, slim. That is not the classification we are talking about. We are talking about classification at this highest possible level of causal body. So maybe someday we will come back to this human structure. It's very important, in my view, to understand this properly, because otherwise a lot of misconceptions can occur as we go on. For example, if we were to talk about reincarnation, a question would be, what reincarnates? And that can only be understood if the human structure is properly understood. Now, the assumption, the key assumption that that the Sankhya philosophers made has to do with the topic of Prakriti. And so it was assumed before that there is this Brahman as the ultimate reality. And what the Sankhya philosophers did was to also propose that there is something called Prakriti, which coexists with Brahman as an independent ultimate reality. And what this universe is a transformation of that Prakriti. So you might think of Prakriti almost like primordial matter, which got transformed to everything that we see today, which is not unlike what science is proposing. So that was the assumption, the Prakriti assumption that was made by the Sankhya philosophers. And it seems to me that if this transformation is going to occur, then Prakriti would have to be Asankhya and not Ananta. Brahman was described as Ananta, meaning uncountably infinite. Prakriti would have to be countably infinite for it to be able to react with each other and to create something else like a tree or a human being. So Prakriti, at least as far as I think, would have to be Asankhya. And at one time, I remember maybe 10 years ago when I was looking at this subject, I had proposed a picture of Prakriti that looked like this. At that time, and Dr. Sane might remember this, since I had talked to him about it then, I was tending to call it God particle, but unfortunately for me, it turned out that that word was already taken by Higgs boson. The boson was originally called the goddamn particle. just for your information, because scientists were unable to find it. And over time, over decades, that changed to God particle. And it may well have been because, more and more money was needed to find it. And this may have been a more of a marketing ploy uh, to call it that. But I'm changing the name of this from God particle to Brahmanu, meaning naming it after the god Brahma, the creator god of Hinduism, and Anu simply means atom. And originally at that time, I thought that I had a brilliant idea of combining matter with consciousness. Well, as with many good ideas, it turns out that a whole bunch of other people had thought about the same subject, and maybe a couple of thousand years ago proposed this notion that the original atom, shall we say, that constitutes Prakriti may have included not just matter, but also consciousness. And that whole idea is what we now refer to as panpsychism. So that was my attempt. This was my attempt to show that combination wherein we have a circle that is very visible with a dot, a circle with a dot that is extremely visible, with an Om which is practically invisible inside of that circle. Obviously, the Om represents consciousness, and the circle with a dot is the representation of matter, as one might think of as an electron circling a nucleus. So that was the notion behind this Prakriti. Now, the assumption, now let us come to the assumption that Sankhya philosophers made. They assumed that this Prakriti was non-homogeneous. See, we have assumed Brahman to be homogeneous. We assume Brahman to be Ananta and homogeneous. Prakriti, I am saying, is Asankhya and non-homogeneous. In particular, the Sankhya assumption is that that Prakriti consists of three qualities of matter, three gunas or qualities of matter, which we will refer to as SRT, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. And I think you're all familiar with what this, we are all familiar to some degree with what Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas mean. And quite often people have this idea. They think that people know that Sattva is better than Rajas is better than Tamas, right? So there is a sequence to this, that we are being told that we should become more sattvic, for example. And in particular, we are also being told in Bhagavad Gita, for instance, that we should transcend these gunas, whatever that means. It's almost like getting beyond the gunas is what the word transcend might mean to some people. So there is this feeling, as I've talked to a number of people on this subject, there is this feeling that it is almost like the game of, American football. It's almost like saying that a running back picks up the ball at his own 0-yard line, starts running, and then he crosses the 30-yard line, and it's as if he has gone from the Tamas region into the Rajas region. And Rajas meaning he keeps moving faster and faster and faster, and he crosses the 70-yard line, and he has now moved from Rajas to the Sattvic region and eventually touchdown, right? He has gone beyond gunas. That could be and often is the kind of thinking that some people have regarding these gunas, and the facts of the matter are completely different. The game of life, according to Hinduism, is not being played on a rectangular football field. The game of life is being played inside a triangle. And we shall see what that triangle looks like. It is not the Bollywood triangle, but it is the triangle of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. So we will come to that in a little bit. Now, this Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas that constitute Prakriti, that was the assumption of Sankhya philosophers. If I go back 100 years and talk about what science thought back then, what we were thinking then and what many of us might have learned in school is that this world consisted of electrons, protons, and neutrons. Three things: electrons, protons, and neutrons. For example, hydrogen had one electron, one proton, and no neutrons. And then as you go up in the periodic table, the number of electrons and the number of protons keep on increasing by one. So basically, all the elements of the periodic table consists of different numbers of electrons, protons, and neutrons. And the world is made up of those elements. That was the scientific notion 100 years ago, before quantum mechanics. What the Sankhya philosophers said was that this world is made up of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. The difference was that whereas in science, the world is made up of electrons, protons, and neutrons, but what matters is the number of these fundamental particles. The number of electrons, the number of neutrons, the number of protons, that is what makes up different elements. According to Sankhya philosophy, what makes for differences is not the amount of SRT, not the amount of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, but rather the proportion of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. It is the proportion that matters in Sankhya philosophy. In science, 100 years ago, it was the number that mattered. Okay? So, what would be some analogous situations? Often, this idea is described in terms of a string or a rope that consists of three different strings, one being Sattva, the other being Rajas, and the third being Tamas. I think that's an okay analogy. I would describe it more in terms, for example, of primary colors. The three primary colors, and then by different proportions of the three primary colors, you are able to produce a multitude of other colors. Similarly, with the three different proportions of Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, a multitude of different people come about. So an apt analogy is something like the color analogy. Another one might be that when you make, let us say, if you are making lemonade concentrate, So the idea is that you make this lemonade concentrate, maybe use 1 ounce of it with 7 ounces of water to produce lemonade. Well, what should that lemonade concentrate consist of? Let us say we want to make it using lemon juice, salt, and sugar, 3 ingredients. Then it will turn out that the lemonade concentrate and the lemonade itself will change as you change the proportions of these 3 ingredients. So the taste of lemonade would become a function of the proportions of the 3 ingredients. That is the idea that Sankhya philosophy is telling us, that we all have, as human beings, we all have slightly different proportions of these 3 ingredients called sattva, rajas, and tamas. And depending upon, and the differences between us are a function of those different proportions. So that is the fundamental idea of Sankhya philosophy. What we now want to do is to take this idea and put it in the form of a mathematical equation. So this is the Sankhya assumption. Some aspects of this equation might be, you may or may not be familiar with it, even though it looks like a very simple equation. What I'm saying is that this causal body that I talked about earlier, right? The causal body that I talked about earlier is a function of sattva, rajas, and tamas. And you remember the position of that causal body in this structure. It was at one of the highest levels in this structure. And Bhagavad Gita describes it. Chapter 14, verse 5 says this: Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, qualities of matter. Right? What I have said earlier is right here. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, qualities of matter, bind the immortal Atman and the body together. It is that entity that binds Atman and the rest of the body. Right? That is why it occupies this particular position in this hierarchical structure. And what I'm saying here is that causal body is simply the combination of sattva, rajas, and tamas as shown in this equation. Now, this alpha, beta, and gamma, these are those of you who are familiar with this kind of mathematics and engineering and so on, and I know there are a number of people that do not require all this elaborate explanation. But in general, we might, for example, say that somebody has 70% sattva. So this alpha would be 70%. Maybe 20% rajas. So beta would be 20%. And 10% tamas. So gamma would be 10%. That's what this equation is saying. What makes this equation complicated is the fact that there is a constraint that alpha plus beta plus gamma must always be 100%. So you cannot have 100% sattva and 100% rajas, because then alpha plus beta would become 200%, and that is not acceptable. So this constraint is what was proposed. They may not have written it in this way, but this is what was proposed as the constraint by Sankhya philosophy. Simple equation, but a constrained equation, right? If a person has equal proportions of sattva, rajas, and tamas, then alpha, beta, and gamma would be equal to each other. Each of them would be 33%, 33 and a third percent. That's what this is saying. So hopefully the equation at least is clear, to some degree. Now the question is, what does this assumption actually mean? How can we understand this equation a little bit better and evaluate its consequences? So let's look at it this way. Here are three axes as we normally plot them. This is the sattva axis, this is the tamas axis, and this is the rajas axis. So here is 100%, this little dot here, where my pointer is. This is 100% rajas. This is 100% tamas. And this is 100% sattva. Right? Remember that we have a constraint that sattva, rajas, and tamas must add up to 100%. So for example, if I take a point like this, where my pointer is, I hope you can see the pointer. If I take a point here in this space, this point will have coordinates of 100% rajas and 100% tamas. So this point, sattva, rajas, and tamas add up to 200%, which is not acceptable. So this point does not satisfy our constrained equation. What satisfies our constrained equation, the points that satisfy them? This is a point that satisfies that equation because it says rajas is 100%, tamas is 0, and sattva is 0. So this point is acceptable. Similarly, this point is also acceptable with 100% tamas. And this point is also acceptable. So as you think about it in this manner, the conclusion is that all those points that lie on this triangle, are the only points that are acceptable for this equation to be true. And that happens if this constraint were not there, then the entire three-dimensional space would have been acceptable. But because there is this constraint, it limits the acceptable points to this triangular region. And that triangular region is what I am calling the Tri Guna Trikon. Trikon simply means triangle. Tri Guna meaning the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. This Tri Guna Trikon looks like that. Here is 100% sattva. This is 100% rajas. This is 100% tamas. The rajas axis, I'm spending some time here because many of you may or may not have seen the axis plotted this way. The rajas axis, this is 0% rajas right here. The rajas axis goes vertically up from 0% rajas to 100% rajas. So here is 0% rajas. This is 20% rajas. This is 40% rajas. This is 60%. This is 80%. And ultimately that is 100%. Okay. Here is a point right in the middle. This point 2 is right in the middle of the triangle. And this point is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 of each of the three SRTs, right? This is the tamas axis going from 0% tamas to 100% tamas. This is the sattva axis going from 0% sattva to 100% sattva. I hope this, we can come back to this in Q&A if that is not clear. Okay. But this is that same triangle that I described here, this triangle, plotted in a more standard fashion. And what is being said by these philosophers is that all of us 8 billion people are somewhere inside this triangle. That is the assumption, right? That we are all made up of these three gunas. And the three gunas lie inside this triangle. They cannot be outside here someplace, because outside the triangle, the constraint that the sum of the three gunas must be 100% is not satisfied. So the three gunas are bound to be inside this triangle. And one thing it means is that as the sattva guna increases, as we go from 0% sattva to 100% sattva, what happens to the other two gunas? They reduce. They have to, because the sum of the three has got to be 100%. So if you increase one guna, the sum, one of the other two or both of them have to reduce. That comes as a part of that constraint. So all of us 8 billion people are inside this triangle somewhere, right? Maybe somebody is right smack in the middle. Maybe somebody is up here, etc., etc. Now, it is hard to keep track of 8 billion different combinations. So naturally, the question comes up, how can we deal with this in practice? We cannot deal with 8 billion different things. We have to have a manageable number of categories so we can think about this. How many categories should there be? How many classifications? You see, it is not bad to categorize people. What is bad is to misuse those categories. This must be understood clearly, and I am sure we all do. Right? You have to categorize people by their shoe size. Right? One shoe doesn't fit all. So for that purpose, we need to classify people. Right? We classify people as men and women, so we can figure out which bathroom to use. So there are reasons why we classify people, and that is entirely correct. What is not correct is to misuse those classifications. So the question here is, how many categories should there be? So for example, it could be that we think of categorizing people into two categories, like shown here, two categories. So it could be these two. Just draw a vertical line down, and this is category A, and this is category B. Well, what would happen then? Then what would happen is that this category A will include people that have 100%, that are 100% sattvic. It would also include people that are 100% rajas, and the differences between these people will be so great as to make this classification completely useless. What do we want? Why do we want to classify this? The reason is that we cannot understand, we cannot keep track of 8 billion different numbers. So we are trying to reduce that number to some sort of a single digit classification, so we can understand it and deal with it. But we want to classify things in such a way that within a particular category, people are similar in terms of their gunas. People are similar. And between categories, people are different. That's the way to classify just about anything. That within the category, the differences are small. Between categories, the differences are big. So this two category classification will not work. What about three categories? This would have been really easy to propose, isn't it? Because we could have then said that here is a sattvic person, here is a rajasic person, and here is a tamasic person. Those would have been the three categories. That would have been very simple to propose, but that was not proposed. Why not? Because once again, the differences, say, take for example, this center point. This center point has 33% of each of the gunas. So a person with 33% sattva, this is the sattva axis, 33% sattva and 100% sattva is being lumped into the same group. And that doesn't seem appropriate. So the number of categories needs to be small. But at the same time, the differences within a category have to be somewhat small and not as big as that proposed here. Right? So here comes a reasonable classification that classifies this triangle into 4 categories. Okay. And this is what actually was, I assume, this is what actually was proposed. This is why we have 4 categories, Chatur Varna. Right? This S shows that the people in this category have more than 50% sattva guna. 50% is right here on this line. This category shows that people in this little triangle have more than 50% rajas. People in this little triangle have more than 50% tamas. This is 100% tamas right here in this corner. And people in this middle triangle have more or less equal proportions in a way of these 3 gunas. So that is the basic idea of 4 personalities. Right? A sattvic personality, a rajasic personality, a tamasic personality, and a balanced personality. So I'm going to stop very soon. So this is the consequence of taking the Sankhya assumption, putting it in the form of this little equation, which follows directly from what they said, and then simply examining the consequence of that equation and proposing why the 4 personalities turn out to be, why there are 4 classes, and what the composition of those classes is. So let me stop here. What would have been, if there was more time, if there were more time, what would have been more appropriate to do, and maybe we'll get to do it some other time, is to talk about the human structure in greater details, the various classification systems in greater detail. We have not talked about how to use this for self-assessment and for self-improvement. We have not talked about what it means to transcend gunas. There is no way of escaping this triangle. We are always going to be inside this triangle, no matter what. So what does it mean to transcend gunas? We haven't quite talked about that. So there are a number of things that I have glossed over, so that there is some time for me to listen to your comments. So that's where I am. And the only one other thing I would say is that we should attempt to bring back the Varna system as originally intended. It is only very recently that personality classification systems have come into vogue. And this is the original personality classification system. We need to bring it back in a 21st century manner to compete with other personality assessment and improvement tools. Perhaps we can computerize it. If enough people in this group are willing to work together, it could well be the Minnesota assessment tool. So something along those lines is worth doing. Let me stop here and stop sharing this.
I'm always amazed at how beautifully you use mathematics and statistics to explain very complex phenomenon in simple terms. I appreciate that. I have a much better understanding of the Varna system now. In the triangle that you showed, that probably includes the traditional Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yes,
okay.
That's absolutely the case. I did not, I would like to use a different set of words for Brahman, Kshatriya, etc.
Yes.
Just to make sure that we don't continue to confuse the Varna system with the caste system.
Yeah.
So that is one thing. That's why I ended up using the alphabets that I used there.
Thinker, doer, fighter.
Something like, well,
keep quieter.
That, that's why I think that this Minnesota group is exactly the right group to take this subject and bring it into the 21st century. The only other thing I would, and other people are trying to do this. I mean, it's not like nobody's working on it, but I think there is enough intellectual power in this group in order to do all of that. You need people who understand Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas well. You need people who have background in psychology, maybe somebody who with some statistics knowledge, maybe somebody who has done these kinds of questionnaires. So I do think that right in this group, I can see people right now who can work together to create the kind of system that we need. And that will go a long way in this caste debate that is taking place in United States these days, and in making sure that Hinduism doesn't get blamed for that. The only one other thing I would say, Prasanna, is that the composition of the four Varnas, I may have a slightly different composition than perhaps is there in the books on Bhagavad Gita. So that we will have to discuss at some other point. But basically, it is describing the four Varnas, as you said.
One thing that I wanted to add is that all the vertices that you have shown in your triangles, including the triangle within the triangle. So as we know from our scriptures, and anybody can correct me if my notion is incorrect, that there is always some positive proportion of all the three gunas, meaning none of the gunas can be zero in any person or personality. So if you combine that fact, then then those some of the vertices are not really in question. That also comes from scriptures, for my understanding.
That
Meaning,
is, I
right?
completely agree with that. The when we talk of, I mean, we all have to sleep, so it isn't that. So at different times of the day, we probably exhibit different gunas, shall we say? So when we talk in these terms, we are talking on the average.
Mhm.
I know that you are into mathematics, so it's on the average kind of a statement.
Right, right. And other point that I wanted to add is these proportions or the unique proportion that you talked about, and I fully agree that with that unique proportion there can be infinite number of combinations, and therefore we can describe all 8 billion people. And I would extend it to also the inanimate entities of this creation as well, not just the people but the animals or the fish or even mountains and the rivers. And so when you talk about this personality, that's for the human being primarily. But my thought goes along with the entire creation, meaning if you think of the mountains, then the mountain perhaps have more proportion of tamas, and therefore they are immobile. They will move once in million years or something like that. A river can perhaps be described with the more proportion of rajas because they are very agile. They always move. So those thoughts also come to my mind when I try to match with the personality, so to say. And when I say personality, not necessarily persons, but also other objects. So that's another thought I wanted to inject in our minds, that these 3 gunas, they span not just the human beings or the animate objects, but also inanimate, so-called inanimate. It kind of relates to also the existence of soul into in the inanimate objects as well, right? You might, I'm sure many of you heard of that. So
Yeah.
those are the
Okay.
2 concepts
Yeah,
I wanted to
sure.
share, basically.
Yeah. No, I think what happens is, if you maybe we can talk offline someday, but what happens is that when you get into those areas, then the mathematics has to be extended considerably, and it is not.
I will email you the article that I wrote that
Okay.
might give some ideas.
Yeah. So that is not that easy to include all these other factors. Plus, Bhagavad Gita was written for human beings. He did not intend it to be written for insects and other inanimate things.
Mhm.
Had he intended that, he could have easily done it, but he didn't do it. So I'm limiting. All of this is completely based upon what has been said in Bhagavad Gita. I didn't invent any of this. I simply put it in mathematical terms, yes. But it is based entirely on what Sri Krishna has said in Bhagavad Gita. Let's go to somebody else if.
Well, I had a question that is exactly addresses the point that was just raised about extending these concepts beyond human beings. And I personally have great doubts about that because it strikes me as being an example of superimposing human attributes on other kinds of other aspects of the universe. And yes, you can do that. And to a certain extent, artists do that when they make paintings and so on. But there is a traditional caution within science for not doing that, because then you are operating on assumptions about the nature of other kinds of organisms that need to be examined.
Yeah, and I think, I completely agree with what you're saying. Also, even if one tried to extend this to other species, etc., the ranges of, I mean, first of all, making potentially a wrong assumption that the same 3 gunas apply all over the place, and how it all works. The ranges of each of these gunas become so different. I mean, a human being who is tamasic and a stone is a totally different entity. they are nowhere near each other in terms of their tamasic-ness. And it's hard enough as it is. So I thought it might be best, at least for now, to limit it to humans. I can see it either.
Very fascinating presentation. I think it is, you just touch one part of the morning's topic, trying to decipher the Varnas in the 4 different categories, the way you beautifully placed in. I like them. But I think it's important to address your question in several ways. One is you have to live in the times where we live. What I'm saying is, at the present time, even though there's a good intellectual discussion that we had this morning, in the present day and age, the Varna system or so-called caste system has been under severe criticism around the world. So I think one of the first objective that each one of us should have is to understand what Varna is, what caste is, what jati is, so that people don't get confused with all these terminologies. So I think I would emphasize to put those sub-classifications in clear understanding of everybody else. On the second part of it, on the smaller group like you're talking about, we can certainly work on your suggestion and refine the Varna system for our smaller group. That's perfectly fine. But I think more education needs to be given to make sure that our society, our community, our faith tradition is properly represented in the world, because we don't live in the vacuum. We have to deal with the other entities that is. So we have to take necessary, essential steps now to make sure we understand what is Varna is, what is Jati is, and what is caste system is. So I was hoping that some other time we can discuss that topic in greater detail. At the same time, your suggestion on refining the Varnas the way you want it, we can proceed. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, you bring up very good points, especially now that there is a great deal of debate that is going on in this country. I mean, in India, it has always been, but in this country, which I think personally is so tremendously misplaced. But nonetheless, it has come up, and it is going to potentially affect the younger generation.
Right.
And therefore, what you're saying is so apt that people in this group that I'm looking at understand these things as to what the differences are.
I'm not quite sure about that either, but everybody understands the way they want to understand.
Between all these 3 entities, and we can describe those, or somebody can describe those in greater detail. I have heard some extremely good videos on this topic. So if nobody else, we can play one of those videos, and that will do an excellent job of where this caste system came from, what the Portuguese contribution was to the creation of even the word caste, for that matter, etc., etc. I have heard some excellent presentations on that subject. I think that also that there are 2 ways of dealing with this. One is to sort of say, well, isn't it really bad that we had this, or we still have this caste system, and it becomes a very defensive approach to dealing with it. Like, we did something so wrong, and, aren't we very bad people or something like that? I would rather go back to the original system and implement it the way it was intended. And that's a positive, to be on the offensive, shall we say, in this matter. And that's why I am suggesting what I am, which is to take the original system of personality, classification. You've all read the book, What Color is Your Parachute? It is dealing with that. And, let's bring it into today's terminology, which is not offensive and which doesn't rely on what we have done, the terminology of the caste system, and make sure that our younger people understand this and can actually use it for their own benefit, for their own personal improvement. I mean, that's the ultimate. So that's why I think it is important to do it.
Namaste. I have put one of those videos. Someone has written a book which says caste is not Hindu, right? He's not from US, but he talks about the issues we are facing today also. And it will be a good link to follow. It's also there on the, I have put it on the hinduresource.org under one of the link so that people can understand, like how this system was created, like what we call caste system, which we are dealing with, is about 200 years or maybe less, 150 years old. But before that, Varna and Jati, and they equated to Varna, to caste, and then categorized the Jatis, which are like thousands of them,
Yes.
into, into the four Varnas or four, castes. And then they classified them, and then they ordered them, created, hierarchy as to, okay, so you are better because you are good for my colony. You are bad. So I'll put you into out of the system. And, because if you are rebel, they do not want, the colonists didn't want that people should rebel. And after 1857 of the, what they call mutiny, and it was a freedom fight for India to get the British out. So they created the system and they converted, and then they used the stick to beat people up. Caste is a stick to beat all the Hindus of India up and then convert them and to Christianity and things like that. So that was the system which was created, and they have used it, and even our leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and in all our last previous 3-4 generations who have come about, who were educated by the British system, who are educated people, they have been taught the same thing, and they begin to hate that. Okay, we are casteist, we are this, we are that. So it's like a pre-planned, a long-term philosophy, and nowadays it's like we are facing it even in US, that okay, it's being equated, caste is being equated to racism, and racism is bad, it's equated to slavery and things like that, which never existed there. In India, there was nothing like a slavery, which is the only maybe culture where was no slavery. But so there is a good video. If you can watch it, it'll be good. I have put the link in there in the chat. So thank you.
Arun, there is also one by the president of HUA, right?
Yeah, Hindu University of America.
Hindu University of America.
Of America. What is his name? Vishwanathan? It's
Kalyan Vishwanathan.
Yeah, Kalyan Vishwanathan. There is an excellent video by him. He personally delivered it, that I heard of, some time ago on this, where this caste system came from, and the European version of that caste system, etc., etc. He does a very good job of describing all of that. So if we can find that, that might be another one to use. In this.
I think I have the talk he delivered about maybe a month and a half ago or so.
Yes, that's the one that's the one I'm talking about.
Okay,
Yeah,
so I should have it actually.
Anand, I have to say something.
And I know you mentioned the Minnesota group, and I was thinking of who are myself, kind of coordinating or joining forces with them. That university can be useful.
Yeah, I think we can try to put something together.
Discrimination, if we don't call it caste, things happened in the past India. So that was wrong. We have to admit that first. We
Yes,
should. Okay, so that for me is number one, that whatever injustices occurred were wrong. And then it really should be Varna system where it should be categorized by personal characters, not by the birth. So
yes.
that acceptance has to be there and acknowledgement. Then I'm asking you about something else now. From some readings, I have read that the goal of the person should be to become more and more sattvic. So like more percentage in us should be sattvic. That should be the goal of progress that people strive for. Did you read something like that within your readings that you did? And right? Is
Yes,
that correct?
we want to go generally in that direction. But, the question that comes up is that the characteristics that are described for tamasic, etc., we are going to need, we need them also for just functioning in this life.
Yeah.
So it cannot be that you can become 100% sattvic. That just won't work,
Okay.
right?
So it could be for sadhus. They probably can try to go towards that.
Perhaps. I
Okay.
mean, you want to generally go in that direction, but not to 100%. And
Okay.
that then also brings up the subject, which we never talked about, which is what does it mean to go beyond gunas? I mean, that people can say, well, okay, I understand this triangle. Now I'm going to go from this end of the triangle to this 100% sattvic end and then get out of there, or something like that might be the thought. And that is not right either. So someday we should talk about what it means by transcending gunas.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, this is Madhavi from
Yes.
California. I again, a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed the talk, the new perspective that you bring to the table. When you mentioned that we must revert back to the Varna system now, it raised a question in my mind that, it's easier said than done in the sense of how and who can quantitate the proportions of sattva, raja, and tama in any person. It becomes a question of morality police determining this person is in the sattva category more, or raja category, or tamas, or balanced. Who is going to determine the qualifications of people? So for practical purposes, I don't know how this can be useful.
Well, I mean, in the same sense that the ABCD classification system that perhaps you and I and many of us have gone through, where they say that, this is a type A personality, type B personality, etc., etc. And I remember when I was working for either Pillsbury or Honeywell back a number of decades ago, that we had, such classifications, such training and, so forth in terms of figuring out the differences in personalities. And that is a very useful thing, because these personalities, if you know that somebody is a type A person, it tells you a lot about, how to deal with that individual and what kinds of functions that individual might be better suited for. So that's what I'm getting at in terms of, exactly the question that you are bringing up, which is not so much morality police as much as a rough way of figuring out where you are.
The question was, is it useful at all? I mean, why do we really need it anymore? Because, you want to do an effort. One is because it's being used as a stick to beat you up. That's the reason to understand. And second reason is it really useful for us, right? Because you don't want to waste time or energy on doing something which is not necessary. I mean, we have a problem nowadays. We have our veterans coming back and getting confused in the society, and which is a problem because they do not understand they are Kshatriyas, right? They were Kshatriyas. Now they are being forced into the rule of, maybe a Vaishya, because now we have a society which is basically consumed by, in America, by the, the money, and everything is like money. So who's ruling is in America is the kind of a Vaishya society, right? And when they try to fit into a Vaishya society, they are getting into trouble. They are having mental issues, right? So it's more like a self analysis tool rather than dividing the society or into 4 different categories, but to understand, okay, why am I like this? Because I have this nature, and it's basically to categorize myself and behave and understand that why other people are behaving like this, because people have this, we have a lot of psychological problems because of, we are trying to say everyone is equal, same rule applies to everything. So the rule that applies in the war when a Kshatriya is fighting is different than rule that applies when you are living in the society, because you have changed the place, right? So that's why there's a lot of confusion in the society here, and we have real issues because of that. So that is where it can be helpful, I think.
I think it can serve as a self-improvement too. And that alone is useful enough.